Welcome, friend, to this peaceful hour where we gently peel back the layers of time. Tonight, our story takes place in a world far removed from ours, but still tenderly human. Whether you're drifting off or just looking to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you're here. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, what city or country, and what time it is as you press play. It always amazes me how history can bring strangers together. If this kind of calm historical storytelling brings you peace, consider subscribing. We have many more stories to lull us into the quiet night. But first, let me share something that will blow your mind. The average age for a girl to be married in medieval times wasn't 18 or even 16. In some regions, girls as young as 12 were considered ready for marriage, and the wedding night that followed was often their first and sometimes final encounter with the brutal realities of adult life. This isn't some distant historical footnote we can brush aside. This was the lived reality for millions of women across centuries of human history. Now you might be thinking, surely the wealthy had it better, right? Wrong. If anything, the stakes were even higher for noble families, where a single wedding could determine the fate of entire kingdoms, and the bride was often nothing more than a pawn in a deadly game of political chess. Why medieval weddings were so brutal, Part 1. Let's start with the most disturbing aspect of medieval marriages, the children involved. In medieval Europe, the concept of childhood as we understand it today simply didn't exist. Children were viewed as small adults, and girls in particular were seen primarily through the lens of their reproductive potential. The moment a girl showed signs of physical maturity, she became a commodity in the marriage market. Take the case of Margaret Beaufort, who was first married at age 6 to John de la Pole. While this marriage was thankfully never consummated, it demonstrates how early the marriage machinery began grinding. Margaret would go on to be married 4 times, bearing her only child, the future Henry VII, when she was just 13 years old. The birth was so traumatic that she never had another child, despite 3 subsequent marriages. But Margaret's story, while tragic, was actually considered fortunate by medieval standards. She survived childbirth, which was far from guaranteed. For many young brides, their wedding day marked the beginning of a countdown to their death in childbirth. The medieval period saw maternal mortality rates that would horrify us today. In some regions, as many as 1 in 3 women died from complications related to pregnancy and childbirth. Consider the fate of Isabella of Valois, who was married to Richard II of England when she was just 6 years old. The marriage was part of a peace treaty between England and France, and Isabella's value was measured entirely in terms of the political alliance she represented. When Richard II was deposed and murdered, 11-year-old Isabella found herself a widow, immediately thrust back into the marriage market as a valuable political asset. The wedding ceremonies themselves were often elaborate affairs, but not for the reasons you might think. These weren't celebrations of love or even family unity. They were public demonstrations of wealth, power, and political alliances. The bride and groom were often the least important people at their own wedding. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical noble wedding looked like in medieval times. The bride would be dressed in the finest clothes her family could afford, not because it was her special day, but because her appearance reflected directly on her family's status and wealth. Every detail of her outfit, from the fabric to the jewelry, sent a message about her family's political connections and financial resources. The ceremony itself was a complex web of legal and religious obligations. Marriage contracts were drawn up months or even years in advance, detailing everything from the bride's dowry to the specific lands and titles that would change hands. These weren't romantic documents. They read more like business mergers, complete with clauses about what would happen if the bride failed to produce male heirs, or if political circumstances changed. The religious ceremony, while important, was often secondary to the legal and political aspects of the union. The church's role was to legitimize what was essentially a business transaction, providing divine sanction for arrangements that had been made for entirely worldly reasons. But here's where things get truly dark. The wedding night wasn't just the beginning of a marriage. It was often a young girl's introduction to violence and trauma that would define the rest of her life. Medieval medical texts and personal accounts from the period reveal a shocking acceptance of what we would today recognize as sexual assault and abuse. Young brides were often given little to no preparation for what would happen on their wedding night. Many had never been alone with a man before, let alone been intimate with one. The concept of consent, as we understand it today, was virtually non-existent. A wife's body belonged to her husband, legally and practically, and resistance was not just discouraged, but often violently suppressed. The brutal reality was that many medieval marriages were consummated through what amounted to rape. Historical records from the period include advice to new husbands on how to break in their young wives, language that reveals the violent nature of these encounters. Medical texts from the time discuss treatments for injuries that new brides commonly sustained, injuries that speak to the physical trauma these young women endured. Agnes Paston, a member of the English gentry in the 15th century, wrote letters describing the abuse she witnessed and experienced. In one particularly harrowing account, she describes how a 14-year-old bride was so severely injured on her wedding night that she required medical attention for weeks afterward. The girl's injuries were so extensive that there were doubts about whether she would survive to fulfill her primary purpose, bearing children. This wasn't considered scandalous or unusual. It was simply the reality of medieval marriage. Young women were expected to endure whatever their husbands inflicted upon them, and their families were often complicit in this abuse. After all, the bride's family had already received their payment in the form of political alliance or financial compensation. The transaction was complete, and the bride's suffering was now her husband's concern. The psychological trauma was equally devastating. Imagine being a child, torn from everything familiar, married to a stranger, and then subjected to violence and abuse with no possibility of escape. Many young brides never recovered from this initial trauma, spending the rest of their short lives in a state of depression and fear that medieval medicine was powerless to address. But the brutality didn't end with the wedding night. Medieval marriages were characterized by an ongoing cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and recovery that often proved fatal. Women were expected to produce children, particularly male heirs, as quickly and as frequently as possible. There was no concept of family planning or spacing pregnancies for the mother's health. The pressure to produce male heirs was enormous, and women who failed to do so faced serious consequences. Anne of Cleves, while from a slightly later period, exemplifies this pressure. Her marriage to Henry VIII was annulled partly because she failed to immediately become pregnant, and she was fortunate to escape with her life when so many other wives of Henry VIII did not. Even when women did become pregnant, the dangers were far from over. Medieval obstetric care was primitive at best, and often actively harmful. Midwives had little understanding of hygiene or proper medical procedures, and maternal mortality rates reflected this ignorance. Wealthy women fared somewhat better, having access to better nutrition and more experienced attendants, but even they faced significant risks. The story of Blanche of Castile illustrates both the political importance of childbearing and its dangers. Married to Louis VIII of France, Blanche successfully bore 12 children, an achievement that secured her position and influence. However, the physical toll was enormous, and she spent much of her adult life either pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or mourning children who died in infancy. For every success story like Blanche's, there were countless women who weren't so fortunate. Medieval records are filled with accounts of women who died in childbirth, often after producing several children. These deaths weren't treated as tragedies, but as unfortunate but expected occupational hazards of being a woman. The children born from these marriages faced their own brutal realities. Infant mortality rates were staggering, with some estimates suggesting that as many as half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Those who survived often found themselves thrust into the same cycle that had claimed their mothers, with girls being married off as soon as they reached physical maturity. This cycle of early marriage, frequent pregnancy, and high mortality created a society where women were valued primarily for their reproductive capacity and political connections. Their individual desires, dreams, and well-being were secondary considerations at best. The legal framework surrounding medieval marriage reinforced these brutal realities. Under medieval law, women had virtually no rights once they married. They couldn't own property, couldn't enter into contracts, and couldn't even leave their husbands without permission. Divorce was virtually impossible, available only in the rarest circumstances, and usually only to men of significant political power. This legal powerlessness meant that women had no recourse when faced with abuse, neglect, or abandonment. They were trapped in marriages that might be physically, emotionally, or sexually abusive, with no legal means of escape. The Church's teaching that marriage was a sacrament that couldn't be dissolved only reinforced this trapped situation. The concept of domestic violence didn't exist in any meaningful legal sense. A husband's right to discipline his wife was widely accepted, and the line between discipline and abuse was often left to the husband's discretion. Medieval law actually codified some of these rights with regulations about the size of stick a man could use to beat his wife, giving rise to the phrase rule of thumb. Economic considerations were paramount in arranging these marriages, often at the expense of any consideration for the individuals involved. Marriage was seen as a way to consolidate landholdings, form political alliances, and secure financial advantages. The bride and groom were often pawns in larger games of power and influence. Dowries could make or break families financially. Parents would often impoverish themselves to provide adequate dowries for their daughters, knowing that an insufficient dowry might condemn their daughter to spinsterhood or a marriage far below her social station. The pressure to provide adequate dowries led some families to place daughters in convents rather than face the financial burden of marriage. This economic dimension of marriage created additional pressures and potential for abuse. Brides who came with insufficient dowries might find themselves mistreated by their new families, seen as burdens rather than assets. Conversely, brides with substantial dowries might find themselves targets for fortune hunters who showed interest only in their wealth. The disparity in ages between medieval spouses often added another layer of complexity and potential trauma to these arrangements. It wasn't uncommon for young girls to be married to much older men, sometimes old enough to be their grandfathers. These age gaps weren't accidental, but were often deliberately arranged to take advantage of the older man's established wealth and position. Consider the marriage of 6-year-old Isabella of Valois to 29-year-old Richard II of England. The 23-year age gap represented not just a difference in maturity, but an enormous power imbalance that would have coloured every aspect of their relationship. When the marriage was finally consummated years later, Isabella would have had no frame of reference for a relationship between equals. These age-disparate marriages often meant that young women found themselves widowed at a relatively young age, only to be thrust back into the marriage market. Widowhood, while offering some women a brief taste of independence, was often temporary. Young widows, especially those with valuable political connections or substantial inheritances, were quickly remarried to serve new political or economic purposes. The psychological impact of these brutal marriage practices extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Entire societies were shaped by systems that treated women as property and children as commodities. The normalization of violence and abuse within marriage had ripple effects throughout medieval culture, influencing everything from literature to law to religious teaching. Medieval literature, while often romanticizing courtly love, also reveals the underlying brutality of marriage practices. The idealized love between knights and ladies in medieval romances was often explicitly contrasted with the harsh realities of actual marriage. The fact that romantic love was portrayed as existing outside of marriage speaks volumes about what marriage was actually like for most people. The Church's role in perpetuating these brutal practices was complex and often contradictory. While Christianity preached love and compassion, the medieval Church's interpretation of marriage often emphasized submission and duty over mutual affection and respect. The theological justification for women's subordination within marriage drew on selective biblical interpretations that reinforced existing power structures. Religious ceremonies surrounding marriage often emphasized the transfer of the woman from her father's authority to her husband's authority, rather than celebrating the creation of a new partnership between equals. The language used in medieval marriage ceremonies made explicit what was often implicit. The woman was being given by one man to another, with little regard for her own wishes in the matter. As we've seen, medieval weddings were brutal not because of any single element, but because they represented the intersection of multiple systems of oppression and violence. The combination of extreme youth, legal powerlessness, economic pressure, physical danger, and social isolation created a perfect storm of suffering for medieval brides. These weren't isolated incidents or exceptions to otherwise humane practices. This was the systematic and normalized treatment of women and children in a society that valued political and economic advantage over individual human dignity and well-being. The brutality was built into the very structure of medieval society, making it nearly impossible for individuals to escape or resist. The legacy of these brutal practices extended far beyond the medieval period, influencing marriage customs and women's rights for centuries to come. Many of the legal principles that governed medieval marriage persisted well into the modern era, and some of the attitudes and assumptions that justified medieval marriage practices can still be found in various forms today. Understanding the true brutality of medieval weddings isn't just an academic exercise in historical analysis. It's a reminder of how far we've come in recognizing the basic human rights and dignity of women and children, and a warning about how quickly those advances can be lost if we're not vigilant in protecting them. The young girls who were subjected to these brutal marriage practices weren't statistics or historical footnotes. They were real people with hopes, fears, dreams, and desires that were systematically crushed by a society that valued them only for their reproductive capacity and political utility. Their suffering was real, their trauma was lasting, and their voices were silenced by systems designed to keep them powerless. As we reflect on these historical realities, we must remember that progress in human rights and dignity is never guaranteed and never permanent. The same impulses that created these brutal marriage practices still exist in various forms today, and it takes constant vigilance and effort to ensure that we continue moving toward greater recognition of human dignity and equality. The story of medieval weddings is ultimately a story about power. Who has it? Who lacks it? And how it's used to exploit and control others. By understanding these historical realities, we can better recognize and resist similar patterns of exploitation and abuse in our own time, ensuring that the progress we've made in protecting the rights and dignity of women and children continues to advance rather than retreat. Why medieval weddings were so brutal, Part 2. But the nightmare of medieval marriage was only beginning once the vows were spoken. What happened behind the closed doors of these arranged unions reveals a level of brutality that would shock even the most hardened modern observer. The wedding night itself was often a traumatic ordeal, particularly for young brides who had received no education about what marriage would entail. Many girls, as young as 12, found themselves alone with men they barely knew, sometimes decades older, with no understanding of what was expected of them. The concept of marital rape simply did not exist in medieval law or society. A husband's right to his wife's body was considered absolute, regardless of her age, health, or consent. Church doctrine reinforced this belief, teaching that wives must submit to their husbands in all things. The phrase conjugal duty took on a sinister meaning when applied to children who had been sold into marriage by desperate or greedy families. Medical records from the period, sparse as they are, hint at the physical trauma many young brides endured. Physicians wrote of treating girls for injuries that would be immediately recognized today as signs of sexual assault. The wedding feast itself, often celebrated as the highlight of medieval marriage ceremonies, was frequently a grotesque display of male dominance and female subjugation. Guests would make crude jokes about the bride's upcoming defloration, sometimes following the couple to their chambers to witness the consummation. In some regions, the bloodied bedsheets would be displayed the next morning as proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's completion. This public humiliation was considered not only normal, but necessary to validate the union. Marriage contracts from the period read more like bills of sale than agreements between equals. They specified the exact value of the bride in terms of land, livestock, and currency, with detailed provisions for what would happen if she failed to produce male heirs. A woman's worth was measured entirely by her reproductive capacity and her family's wealth. If she proved barren, her husband could seek an annulment, leaving her destitute and disgraced. If she bore only daughters, she might face abandonment or even accusations of witchcraft. The daily reality of married life for medieval women was one of constant surveillance and control. Husbands had the legal right to beat their wives, provided they didn't kill them outright. The phrase rule of thumb allegedly comes from the medieval practice of limiting the thickness of the stick used to beat one's wife to no thicker than a man's thumb. While the etymology is disputed, the sentiment reflects the casual acceptance of domestic violence. Women could not own property, make contracts, or even leave their homes without their husband's permission. They were essentially prisoners in their own lives. Pregnancy, which was expected to occur immediately and repeatedly throughout a woman's fertile years, was itself a death sentence for many. Medieval medicine had little understanding of childbirth complications, and maternal mortality rates were staggering. It's estimated that 1 in 3 women died in childbirth or from related complications. Those who survived often faced a lifetime of difficult pregnancies, miscarriages, and the heartbreak of infant mortality. Children were seen as economic assets rather than beloved family members, and the pressure to produce male heirs was relentless. The Church's role in perpetuating these brutal practices cannot be overstated. Religious doctrine taught that women were inherently sinful, the daughters of Eve who had brought sin into the world. Marriage was presented as a necessary evil to contain female sexuality and ensure legitimate heirs. Priests would counsel wives to endure beatings and marital rape as penance for their inherent wickedness. Divorce was virtually impossible, and women who fled abusive marriages faced excommunication and social exile. The psychological trauma inflicted by these marriages was immense, though rarely documented. Letters and diaries from literate noble women hint at the desperation many felt. Some speak of praying for death rather than facing another pregnancy. Others describe feeling like trapped animals, valued only for their wombs and their silence. The concept of companionate marriage, where spouses might find friendship or even love, was not just rare but actively discouraged as a dangerous distraction from a woman's duties. Even the few protections that existed on paper were rarely enforced. Canon law technically required consent from both parties, but this consent could be coerced, purchased, or simply fabricated. A girl's yes, given under threat of violence or starvation, was considered legally binding. Church courts, theoretically available to hear complaints of abuse, were dominated by men who shared the prevailing attitudes about women's roles. Cases of extreme brutality might result in mild censure, but rarely in any meaningful protection for the victim. The economic aspects of medieval marriage were equally brutal. Women brought dowries to their marriages, essentially paying men to take them as wives. Once married, everything they owned became their husband's property. Widows might inherit a small portion of their husband's estate, but only if they remained unmarried and chaste. Remarriage meant losing even these meager rights. The pressure to remain financially dependent kept women trapped in abusive situations with no means of escape. The wedding ceremony itself was designed to reinforce these power dynamics. The bride was literally given away by her father to her husband, like a piece of property changing hands. Wedding vows included promises of obedience that were legally binding. The ring ceremony symbolized the husband's ownership of his wife, much like a brand on livestock. Even the tradition of carrying the bride over the threshold originated from the practice of symbolically capturing her and bringing her into captivity. For the vast majority of medieval women, marriage meant the end of any autonomy or hope for happiness. They went from being controlled by their fathers to being controlled by their husbands, with no period of independence or self-determination. Their lives were mapped out from birth, childhood preparation for marriage, a brutal wedding night, decades of pregnancy and childbearing, and finally, if they survived, a lonely widowhood dependent on male relatives' charity. The idea that marriage could be a partnership between equals was not just foreign, but heretical. The brutality of medieval weddings and marriages wasn't an unfortunate side effect of the times. It was the system working exactly as designed. These practices served to maintain male power, transfer wealth between families, and ensure the continuation of patriarchal bloodlines. Women were the casualties of a system that viewed them as less than human, valuable only for their reproductive capabilities and their labor. The romantic notions we have today about medieval chivalry and courtly love existed only in literature, and only for a tiny elite. For the overwhelming majority, marriage was a form of legalized slavery that lasted until death. This legacy of brutality didn't end with the medieval period. Many of these attitudes and practices persisted for centuries, some echoing into modern times. Understanding this history isn't just an academic exercise. It's crucial for recognizing how deeply embedded these power structures remain in our society. The fight for women's rights, for true equality in marriage, and for the recognition of women as full human beings worthy of dignity and respect is still ongoing. The medieval period shows us how far we've come, but also how vigilant we must remain to protect the progress that has been made. Looking at your script and the reference materials, I can see you're creating an engaging historical narrative about medieval wedding brutality. Here's part 3 of your 12-part script, continuing from where you left off. The institution of marriage in medieval times was not merely a union between two people, but a complex web of legal, economic, and social arrangements that often trapped women in cycles of violence and subjugation. To understand the true brutality of medieval weddings, we must examine how these ceremonies served as the formal beginning of a woman's legal death. Under the doctrine of coverture, which dominated medieval legal systems across Europe, a married woman ceased to exist as a legal entity the moment she spoke her wedding vows. The very phrase "to cover" meant that a husband's legal identity completely absorbed his wife's. She could not own property, sign contracts, or even control her own wages if she worked. Everything she had been, everything she owned, and everything she would ever earn became his property as surely as his livestock or his land. This legal erasure was not some abstract concept confined to dusty law books. It had immediate and devastating consequences that began on the wedding day itself. Picture a young bride, perhaps only 13 or 14 years old, standing before a priest and formally surrendering not just her autonomy, but her very existence under the law. The wedding ceremony was essentially a transfer of ownership, with the bride's father handing over his property to her new husband in exchange for political alliance or financial gain. The wedding night itself was often the first manifestation of this complete legal powerlessness. With no concept of marital rape existing in medieval law, a husband could do whatever he pleased to his wife without fear of legal consequence. She had no right to refuse him, no right to seek help if he hurt her, and no right to leave if the situation became unbearable. The wedding bed became a place of terror for countless young women who had no understanding of what was about to happen to them. Medieval medical texts reveal the shocking ignorance surrounding women's bodies and sexuality. Physicians believed that women were simply defective men with reproductive organs that had failed to develop properly due to insufficient heat in the womb. This fundamental misunderstanding of female anatomy meant that the physical trauma experienced by young brides was often dismissed or ignored entirely. Pain during intercourse was considered normal, even desirable, as it was thought to help women conceive male children. The pressure to produce offspring, particularly male heirs, created another layer of brutality in medieval marriages. A woman's worth was measured almost entirely by her ability to bear sons who could inherit their father's property and titles. Those who failed to conceive quickly enough faced accusations of barrenness, which could lead to divorce, abandonment, or even accusations of witchcraft. The terror of infertility drove many women to consume dangerous potions and submit to painful medical procedures that often did more harm than good. Consider the case of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the medieval period. Despite her immense wealth and political influence, she was still subject to the brutal realities of medieval marriage. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France was annulled, partly because she had failed to produce a male heir after 15 years. She was immediately remarried to Henry II of England, demonstrating how even queens were valued primarily for their reproductive capacity rather than their individual worth or achievements. The physical dangers of childbirth in medieval times cannot be overstated. Without proper medical knowledge or sanitary conditions, pregnancy and delivery were often death sentences. Maternal mortality rates were staggering, with some estimates suggesting that 1 in 4 women died in childbirth. Those who survived often faced years of repeated pregnancies that left their bodies broken and their health permanently compromised. The average noblewoman might expect to be pregnant nearly continuously from her wedding day, until menopause or death, whichever came first. The psychological toll of these marriages was equally devastating. Young women were torn from their families and sent to live among strangers who often viewed them with suspicion or hostility. They had no friends to confide in, no family to protect them, and no legal recourse when their husbands abused them. Depression and madness were common among medieval wives, though these conditions were typically attributed to female weakness rather than the traumatic circumstances of their lives. The Church, which wielded enormous influence over medieval society, actively reinforced these oppressive marriage practices through its teachings and canon law. Biblical passages about wives submitting to their husbands were emphasized while verses about mutual love and respect were largely ignored. Priests regularly preached that women were inherently sinful and needed the firm guidance of male authority to keep them on the righteous path. The story of Eve's temptation of Adam was used to justify treating all women as potential sources of corruption and evil. This religious justification for female subjugation extended far beyond the pulpit. Medieval art and literature consistently portrayed women as either pure, passive virgins or dangerous, sexually voracious temptresses. There was no middle ground that allowed for women to be seen as complex human beings with their own desires, ambitions, and capabilities. This cultural messaging reinforced the idea that women needed to be controlled and dominated for the good of society. The economic aspects of medieval marriage further entrenched women's powerlessness. Dowries, which were supposedly given to support the bride in her new life, actually became the property of her husband upon marriage. If he died, she might receive a portion of his estate as her dower, but this was often disputed by his male relatives, who saw her as an outsider trying to steal their inheritance. Widows, despite their theoretical legal independence, frequently found themselves destitute and vulnerable to exploitation. The brutality of medieval marriage extended beyond individual relationships to shape entire social structures. The systematic oppression of women through marriage customs helped maintain rigid class hierarchies and prevent social mobility. Women could not inherit or pass on property in their own right, which meant that wealth and power remained concentrated in male hands. This created a self-perpetuating system where each generation of women was raised to accept their subordinate status as natural and divinely ordained. The violence inherent in medieval marriage was not limited to physical abuse, though that was certainly common. Emotional and psychological abuse were built into the very structure of these relationships. Husbands were encouraged to treat their wives like children who needed constant supervision and correction. Wife-beating was not only legal, but was actually recommended by many medieval authorities as a necessary tool for maintaining household order. Legal texts specified the appropriate size of sticks that could be used to beat wives, giving rise to the expression, rule of thumb. These marriage customs had profound implications for society as a whole. When half the population was systematically brutalized and oppressed, it created a culture of violence that permeated every level of social interaction. Children who witnessed their mothers being abused learned that might makes right, and that those with power could do whatever they pleased to those without it. This cycle of violence was passed down through generations, creating the foundation for the feudal system's oppressive hierarchy. The legacy of medieval marriage brutality extends far beyond the Middle Ages themselves. Many of the legal and social customs that emerged during this period continued to influence Western society for centuries afterward. The idea that women were naturally inferior to men and needed male protection and guidance persisted well into the modern era. The notion that marriage gave husbands unlimited rights over their wives' bodies and property remained embedded in legal systems until remarkably recent times. Understanding the true brutality of medieval weddings requires us to look beyond romantic notions of chivalry and courtly love to see the harsh realities that shaped women's lives. These were not merely different times with different customs, but a systematic form of oppression that caused immense suffering for countless individuals. The wedding ceremony itself was often the moment when a young woman's hopes for autonomy and happiness were formally crushed beneath the weight of social expectations and legal constraints. The psychological scars left by these brutal marriage customs extended far beyond the individual women who endured them. They shaped cultural attitudes about gender, power, and relationships that influenced literature, art, religion, and law for centuries to come. The medieval period's treatment of women in marriage represents one of history's most comprehensive and institutionalized forms of gender-based oppression, with effects that continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about women's rights and gender equality. By examining these historical realities honestly and unflinchingly, we can better understand how far society has progressed in recognizing women's fundamental humanity and rights. We can also remain vigilant against any attempts to romanticize or return to these supposedly simpler times when traditional gender roles were more clearly defined. The truth is that these traditional roles were maintained through systematic violence and oppression that caused immeasurable suffering to generations of women who deserved far better than the brutal fate that medieval marriage customs imposed upon them. Why medieval weddings were so brutal, Part 4. We've seen how medieval marriages trapped women in legal servitude, reduced them to breeding stock, and subjected them to systematic violence sanctioned by both church and state. But to truly understand the brutal machinery of medieval matrimony, we must examine the wedding itself. That supposedly joyous ceremony that was, in reality, a carefully orchestrated ritual of submission, humiliation, and the complete erasure of a woman's identity. Picture, if you will, a typical medieval wedding morning. While modern brides wake to excitement and anticipation, a medieval bride often woke to terror. She might be as young as 12, having never met her husband-to-be, knowing only that her father had negotiated the terms of her sale like livestock at market. The night before, her family would have finalized the bride price, the sum her husband paid to acquire her, as if she were a prize heifer or a particularly valuable horse. The morning preparations were not about beauty or joy, but about display and possession. The bride was dressed not to please herself, but to advertise her father's wealth and her new husband's acquisition. Her clothing, jewelry, and even her hairstyle were chosen to demonstrate her value as property. In wealthy families, she might be adorned with jewels and fine silks, not as gifts to her, but as part of the transaction, valuable assets being transferred from one man to another. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterclass in psychological manipulation and public humiliation. Unlike today's ceremonies that celebrate mutual love and partnership, medieval weddings were designed to break the bride's spirit and demonstrate her complete subjugation. The bride was not asked if she consented. Consent was assumed to have been given by her father when he signed the marriage contract. She was simply expected to comply, to speak when spoken to, and to submit gracefully to her fate. Consider the words of the medieval marriage ceremony itself. The bride was required to vow obedience to her husband, not mutual respect or partnership, but absolute, unquestioning obedience. She promised to be bonny and buxom in bed and at board, essentially vowing to be sexually available whenever her husband demanded and to serve his every need. The husband, meanwhile, made no such promises of obedience. His vows were about protection and provision, casting him as the benevolent master of a grateful servant. The symbolism of the ceremony was equally brutal. The bride was literally handed from one man to another, passed like property from father to husband. The wedding ring was not a symbol of mutual commitment, but a mark of ownership, much like the brand on cattle or the collar on a dog. In many regions, the groom would place the ring on each of the bride's fingers in turn, reciting, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost," before finally settling it on the fourth finger, a ritual that symbolically bound her to him through divine authority. But perhaps most disturbing was the public nature of these ceremonies, designed to ensure there could be no escape, no claim that the marriage was invalid. Witnesses were required not just to observe the happy couple, but to legally verify that the woman had been properly transferred to her new owner. The community became complicit in her enslavement, their presence serving as a legal guarantee that she could never claim the marriage was forced or invalid. The wedding feast that followed was equally revealing of the brutal power dynamics at play. While the groom celebrated with other men, drinking and boasting about his new acquisition, the bride often sat in terrified silence, knowing that the evening would end with her first sexual encounter, an event that was rarely consensual and often violent. The other women at the feast, rather than offering comfort, would often regale her with horror stories of their own wedding nights, as if sharing trauma was some sort of twisted bonding ritual. What made these ceremonies particularly insidious was how they wrapped this systematic abuse in the language of celebration and divine blessing. The church taught that marriage was a sacred sacrament, blessed by God Himself. This religious sanctioning made resistance not just socially impossible, but spiritually dangerous. A woman who fought against her marriage wasn't just defying her father and husband, she was defying God Himself, risking eternal damnation for the crime of wanting autonomy over her own life. The wedding night itself deserves special attention for its ritualized brutality. What modern society recognizes as rape was not only legal within marriage, but expected and celebrated. The deflowering of the bride was seen as the husband's right and the completion of the transaction. There was no expectation of gentleness, no consideration of the bride's feelings or desires. She was expected to submit to whatever her husband demanded, no matter how painful or degrading. In many cultures, proof of the bride's virginity was required, with bloodied sheets displayed as evidence that the husband had successfully claimed his property. If no blood was found, the bride could be accused of not being a virgin, leading to annulment, disgrace, and sometimes violence. This practice turned the wedding night into a performance of dominance and submission, with the bride's pain serving as entertainment for the wedding guests, who might wait outside the chamber for proof of consummation. The morning after the wedding brought no relief, only the beginning of a lifetime of sanctioned abuse. The new wife woke to find herself legally dead. Her property now belonged to her husband. Her children would bear his name, and even her body was no longer her own. She had become what legal scholars called a femme covert, a woman whose very existence was covered by her husband's legal identity. She could not own property, could not enter contracts, could not even file legal complaints against her husband, no matter what he did to her. The transition from daughter to wife was so complete and brutal that many medieval texts describe it as a kind of death and rebirth. The woman who had existed before marriage was considered to have died, replaced by an entirely new legal entity whose only purpose was to serve her husband's needs. Her maiden name was abandoned, her family ties severed, and her individual identity erased so completely that she often lost even the right to be buried in her family's plot. For the families involved, these wedding ceremonies were business transactions dressed up as celebrations. The bride's family celebrated getting rid of a financial burden and securing political or economic advantages. The groom's family celebrated acquiring valuable property that would produce heirs and manage their household. The bride herself was rarely consulted about her feelings regarding any of this. Her emotions were considered irrelevant to the important business of male alliance building. The guests at these weddings understood exactly what they were witnessing. They weren't celebrating love or partnership. They were witnessing the legal transfer of human property and the beginning of what was essentially sanctioned slavery. The toasts and celebrations were for the men who had successfully negotiated the transaction, not for the woman whose life had just been destroyed. The brutality of medieval weddings extended beyond the ceremony itself to the complete reshaping of the bride's daily existence. From the moment she said, "I do," her life was no longer her own. Her time, her body, her thoughts, and her future all became the property of a man she might have met only days or hours before. The wedding ceremony didn't just mark a change in her legal status. It marked the end of her existence as an autonomous human being. What makes this system particularly horrifying is how it was presented as natural, inevitable, and divinely ordained. Young girls were raised from birth to accept that this fate awaited them, that their highest purpose was to submit gracefully to their own enslavement. They were taught that resistance was not just futile, but sinful, that God Himself had designed them for this subservient role. The psychological conditioning began in infancy and was reinforced by every institution in medieval society. The Church played a particularly sinister role in sanctifying this abuse. By declaring marriage a holy sacrament, religious authorities gave divine approval to what was essentially a system of human trafficking. They taught that a wife's submission to her husband was submission to God, that her suffering was spiritually purifying, and that any attempt to resist her fate was an act of rebellion against divine will. This religious manipulation made escape psychologically as well as practically impossible. Medieval wedding ceremonies were not anomalies or corruptions of a better system. They were the logical expression of a society built on the systematic oppression of women. Every aspect of these rituals, from the bride price to the public consummation, was designed to reinforce the idea that women were property to be bought, sold, and used as men saw fit. The ceremony itself was a public demonstration of male power and female powerlessness, a ritualized humiliation that set the tone for the bride's entire married life. The legacy of these brutal practices extended far beyond medieval times. The legal principles established in medieval marriage law, that women were property, that husbands owned their wives' bodies, that marital rape was impossible, persisted in Western law for centuries. It wasn't until the late 20th century that many countries finally recognized that a husband could rape his wife, that women had the right to refuse sex even within marriage, and that domestic violence was a crime rather than a husband's prerogative. Understanding the true nature of medieval weddings helps us see how the institution of marriage was weaponized against women for centuries. These ceremonies weren't celebrations of love, but ritualized destructions of female autonomy. They weren't the beginning of partnerships, but the formalization of ownership. And they weren't blessed unions, but systematic human rights violations sanctioned by law, custom, and religion. The young girls forced into these marriages had no advocates, no escape routes, and no hope of rescue. They were sacrificed on the altar of male ambition and social control, their lives destroyed before they had even truly begun. Their suffering was not incidental to the system, but essential to it, the visible demonstration that women existed solely for male benefit and that resistance to male authority would not be tolerated. As we examine these historical practices, we see how institutions that claim to protect and honor women actually served to brutalize and control them. The medieval wedding was perhaps the most perfect expression of this hypocrisy, a ceremony that celebrated the destruction of a human being's autonomy while claiming to honor the sacred bond of marriage. It was brutality disguised as beauty, oppression wrapped in the language of love, and slavery sanctified by the church. The true horror of medieval weddings lay not just in their immediate brutality, but in their systematic nature. This wasn't random violence or individual cruelty. It was an entire society's coordinated effort to ensure that women remained powerless, that their bodies and lives served male interests, and that any dreams of autonomy or self-determination were crushed before they could take root. The wedding ceremony was where this crushing began, and for most women, it was where their hopes for happiness, freedom, or dignity died forever. Based on the reference materials provided, here's part 5 of the 12-part script, Why Medieval Weddings Were So Brutal. The true horror of medieval weddings wasn't just confined to the ceremony itself or the wedding night. It extended into every facet of married life, creating a systematic web of control that would ensnare women for their entire existence. Once the marriage contract was signed and the vows spoken, a woman's legal identity was completely erased through a doctrine known as coverture. This wasn't just a legal technicality. It was the complete obliteration of a human being's right to exist as an independent person. Under coverture, a married woman became what legal scholars called femme couverte, meaning she was literally covered by her husband's legal identity. She could not own property, sign contracts, or even sue someone in court without her husband's permission. Every penny she earned, every possession she brought to the marriage, every inheritance she might receive, all of it legally belonged to her husband. She had become, in the eyes of the law, nothing more than an extension of his will. The legal scholar William Blackstone would later describe this arrangement with chilling clarity. The very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband. This wasn't hyperbole. It was the literal truth of medieval marriage law. A woman's legal existence was suspended, as if she had died the moment she spoke her wedding vows. Consider the practical implications of this erasure. A married woman could not make a will without her husband's consent. She could not buy or sell anything, no matter how trivial. She could not even give away her own clothes or personal items. If she worked and earned money, those wages automatically belonged to her husband. If someone owed her money from before her marriage, her husband could collect that debt as his own property. She had no legal recourse if her husband chose to sell her possessions, spend her inheritance, or even give away her children to others. The system was so thoroughly designed to eliminate female agency that even a woman's body was considered her husband's property. The legal concept of conjugal rights meant that a husband could not be guilty of raping his wife. It was legally impossible because she had no right to refuse him. Her body, her sexuality, her reproductive capacity, all of it belonged to him as completely as his horse or his plough. This legal death extended beyond just property rights into every aspect of daily existence. A married woman could not choose where to live. Her husband could move her anywhere he pleased, regardless of her wishes or family ties. She could not choose her associates. He could forbid her from seeing friends or family members he disapproved of. She could not practice a trade or profession without his permission. She could not even leave the house without his consent. The church reinforced this legal erasure with religious doctrine that painted female submission as a divine commandment. The marriage ceremony itself included the bride's explicit promise to obey her husband, a vow that had legal as well as spiritual implications. Religious texts were constantly quoted to remind women of their subordinate status. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. This wasn't just spiritual guidance, it was a legal mandate backed by both earthly and divine authority. The wedding ring, which modern couples view as a symbol of love and commitment, was in medieval times literally a symbol of ownership. The ring was placed on the bride's finger as a visible sign that she now belonged to another man. It was no different from the brand placed on cattle or the collar placed on a dog. The circular shape wasn't meant to represent eternal love. It represented the unbreakable chain that now bound her to her husband's will. Even the bride's name was stripped away in a ceremony that symbolically enacted her complete absorption into her husband's identity. She would take his surname, losing the last vestige of her individual identity. Her father's name, which had defined her throughout her childhood, was replaced by her husband's name. She was no longer Margaret, daughter of Thomas. She was now Margaret, wife of William, her entire identity defined solely by her relationship to a man. The brutality of this system was compounded by its permanence. While medieval law provided some limited grounds for annulment, such as proving the marriage had never been consummated or that the parties were too closely related, divorce was virtually impossible. A woman who found herself trapped in an abusive marriage had no legal recourse. She could not leave, could not seek protection from the courts, and could not reclaim any of the property or independence she had surrendered at the altar. The few women who attempted to challenge this system faced severe consequences. Records from medieval courts show women being imprisoned, fined, or physically punished for attempting to conduct business without their husband's permission, or for trying to reclaim property they had brought to the marriage. The legal system had no tolerance for women who forgot their place in the social hierarchy. Even widowhood, which might seem like a release from this legal death, brought its own restrictions. A widow could regain some legal rights, but only under strict limitations. She might be entitled to a dower right, typically 1/3 of her husband's estate. But this was often challenged by his family members, who viewed her as an outsider, trying to claim what rightfully belonged to the bloodline. Many widows found themselves embroiled in lengthy legal battles, fighting for basic survival against hostile in-laws who wanted them gone. The psychological impact of this legal erasure cannot be overstated. Imagine growing up knowing that your entire future would involve the complete obliteration of your legal personhood. Every medieval girl understood that marriage meant legal death, that she would cease to exist as an independent being the moment she spoke her wedding vows. This knowledge shaped everything about how women saw themselves and their place in the world. The system created what we might recognize today as learned helplessness on a societal scale. Women internalized their powerlessness because they had no choice. Any attempt to assert independence was met with swift and severe punishment. They learned to navigate their restricted world by manipulating the men who controlled their lives, developing skills in persuasion and indirect influence, because direct action was forbidden to them. Some women attempted to circumvent these restrictions through elaborate legal maneuvers. Wealthy families sometimes created trusts that would allow a daughter to retain some control over her property after marriage. But these arrangements were complex, expensive, and easily challenged in court. The legal system was fundamentally designed to transfer wealth from women to men, and it fought back against any attempts to preserve female ownership. The coverture system also meant that any crimes committed by a married woman were legally considered to be her husband's responsibility. This might seem protective, but it was actually another form of control. If a woman stole something, her husband would be punished, which gave him a powerful incentive to control her behavior strictly. She couldn't even commit crimes independently. Her very capacity for wrongdoing was subsumed under his legal identity. This legal framework created a society where women existed in a perpetual state of childhood, always under the authority of some man. First their fathers, then their husbands, and finally, if widowed, often their adult sons. They were never allowed to experience true adulthood, never permitted to make independent decisions about their own lives. The wedding ceremony wasn't just brutal. It was the formal ceremony that marked a woman's transition from one form of legal bondage to another. The most insidious aspect of this system was how it was presented as protection rather than oppression. Women were told that coverture shielded them from the harsh realities of legal and economic life, that their husbands would handle all the difficult decisions and responsibilities. But this protection came at the cost of their fundamental humanity. They were protected in the same way that livestock is protected, not for their own sake, but for the benefit of their owners. The medieval wedding ceremony thus represented not just a brutal night of violence and humiliation, but the beginning of a lifetime of legal non-existence. It was the moment when a woman's identity was permanently erased, when she ceased to be a person and became instead a piece of property. The vows she spoke weren't promises of love and partnership. They were the formal surrender of her legal right to exist as an independent human being. This system would persist for centuries, its tentacles reaching far beyond the medieval period into the modern era. The doctrine of coverture wasn't fully abolished in most Western countries until the late 19th or early 20th centuries. For hundreds of years, the brutal legal framework established in medieval times continued to deny women their basic humanity, all stemming from that moment at the altar when they promised to obey the man who would legally own them for the rest of their lives. The legacy of this systematic dehumanization shaped women's lives for generations, creating patterns of subordination and control that became so deeply embedded in society that they seemed natural and inevitable. Medieval weddings weren't just brutal ceremonies. They were the foundation of a legal and social system designed to ensure that women would never be allowed to live as fully human beings, their entire existence defined and controlled by the men who owned them. Looking at your script summary and the reference materials, I'll continue with part 6 of why medieval weddings were so brutal, focusing on the systematic dehumanization and violence that characterized these ceremonies. Yet perhaps the most chilling aspect of medieval weddings was how they systematically stripped away every vestige of a woman's humanity, reducing her to nothing more than a vessel for male ambition and dynastic continuity. The wedding ceremony itself was designed as a public spectacle of possession, where the bride was literally handed from one man to another like a prized mare changing owners. The ritual language of medieval marriage ceremonies reveals the true nature of these transactions. The bride was given away by her father to her husband, with no agency in the exchange whatsoever. She was not asked for her consent during the ceremony, but was instead spoken about in the third person, as if she were an object incapable of speech or thought. The wedding vows themselves reinforce this dehumanization, with the bride promising to love, honor, and obey, while the groom was only required to love and cherish, a telling asymmetry that reflected the fundamental inequality built into the institution. The symbolism embedded in wedding traditions further reinforced women's status as property. The wedding ring was placed on the fourth finger of the left hand because medieval people believed a vein ran directly from that finger to the heart, symbolically giving the husband control over his wife's very life force. The act of carrying the bride over the threshold originated from the Roman practice of preventing the bride from tripping as she entered her new home, which would have been considered a bad omen for the household's prosperity. But in medieval times, this gesture took on darker connotations. The husband literally carried his new possession into his domain, emphasizing her complete dependence on his will. The wedding feast that followed the ceremony was equally revealing in its dynamics. While the groom celebrated with his male companions, drinking heavily and boasting of his conquest, the bride sat in virtual silence, often veiled and isolated from the revelry around her. She was displayed like a trophy, her beauty and supposed virtue offered as evidence of the groom's successful negotiation with her family. The guests would make crude jokes about the wedding night to come, treating the bride's impending sexual initiation as entertainment, rather than acknowledging her as a human being with feelings and fears. These celebrations often included disturbing rituals designed to publicly mark the transfer of sexual ownership. In some regions, wedding guests would follow the couple to their bedchamber, making lewd comments and sometimes even remaining to witness the consummation. The bride's terror and humiliation were considered not just acceptable, but amusing to the wedding party. Her tears were dismissed as maidenly shyness, rather than genuine distress at what was essentially legalized sexual assault. The economic dimensions of medieval marriage further emphasized women's status as commodities. The dowry system meant that a woman's family literally paid for the privilege of transferring ownership of their daughter to another man. The bride price, still common in many regions, made this transaction even more explicit. The groom's family purchased the woman outright. These financial arrangements were negotiated entirely between men, with detailed contracts specifying exactly what assets were being exchanged, along with the woman herself. Marriage contracts from this period read like livestock sales agreements, with clauses about the bride's health, fertility, and physical condition. Some contracts even included provisions for returning the bride if she proved defective, unable to bear children, discovered to be unchaste, or suffering from undisclosed ailments. Women were subjected to humiliating physical examinations before marriage to verify their virginity and assess their breeding potential, treated no differently than horses being evaluated for stud purposes. The legal framework surrounding medieval marriage reinforced this dehumanization at every level. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman ceased to exist as a legal entity entirely. She could not own property, enter into contracts, or even control her own earnings. Her husband gained legal control over her body, her labor, and even her thoughts, with church doctrine teaching that a wife's conscience was subsumed into her husband's moral authority. This legal erasure was so complete that married women could not even testify in court without their husband's permission, and their testimony was considered inherently unreliable due to their supposed intellectual and moral weakness. They could not make wills, buy or sell goods, or even seek medical treatment without male authorization. In essence, marriage transformed women from limited legal persons into non-entities, existing only as extensions of their husband's will. The violence inherent in this system extended far beyond the wedding night itself. Medieval marriage customs included numerous rituals designed to break a woman's spirit and ensure her complete submission. New brides were often subjected to public humiliation, designed to establish the husband's dominance from the very beginning. Some regions practiced rough music, where the community would gather outside the couple's home, making noise and crude jokes if the wife was perceived as too assertive or independent. The practice of wife-selling, though not technically legal, was widely tolerated and even formalized in some communities. A husband who grew tired of his wife could literally auction her off to another man, often in the public marketplace alongside livestock and household goods. These sales were conducted with the same ceremonial procedures as other commercial transactions, complete with bills of sale and public announcements. Even more disturbing were the customs surrounding wife-beating, which was not only legal but actively encouraged as a necessary tool for maintaining household order. Medieval law specified the appropriate size of stick a husband could use to beat his wife, giving rise to the phrase rule of thumb, and provided detailed guidance on when and how such discipline should be administered. The Church actively supported these practices, teaching that a husband who failed to physically discipline his wife was neglecting his Christian duty. The psychological warfare embedded in medieval marriage customs was equally brutal. New wives were deliberately isolated from their birth families and childhood friends, creating complete dependence on their husband's goodwill. They were forbidden from learning to read or write in many households, keeping them ignorant and unable to communicate with the outside world. Their movements were strictly controlled, with many women literally locked in their homes when their husbands were away. The constant threat of violence hung over every aspect of married life. Husbands had the legal right to confine, beat, and even kill their wives under certain circumstances. Women who tried to flee abusive marriages faced excommunication from the church, complete social ostracism, and often death from exposure or starvation, since they had no legal means of supporting themselves. Medieval wedding customs also included rituals specifically designed to terrorize the bride into submission. The tradition of the groom removing the bride's garter in front of wedding guests was a public preview of the sexual dominance to come. The throwing of grain and flower petals at the couple symbolized fertility, but also served as a reminder of the bride's primary function as a breeding vessel. Some regions practiced even more explicitly violent wedding traditions. In parts of medieval Europe, the groom would ceremonially cut off a lock of his bride's hair during the wedding ceremony, symbolically claiming ownership of her body. Other customs involved the bride being ritually captured by the groom's party, reenacting the violent origins of marriage as an institution rooted in kidnapping and rape. The systematic nature of this dehumanization was perhaps its most chilling aspect. Every element of medieval wedding customs, from the language used to describe the bride to the legal frameworks governing marriage to the social expectations placed on wives, worked together to strip women of their humanity and reduce them to objects for male use and pleasure. This wasn't an accidental byproduct of medieval marriage, but its explicit purpose. The institution was designed to break women's spirits, crush their independence, and transform them into compliant vessels for male ambition. The wedding ceremony itself was the moment of this transformation, a public ritual marking the death of a woman's individual identity and her rebirth as a man's property. The brutality of medieval weddings thus extended far beyond physical violence to encompass a complete system of psychological, social, legal, and spiritual oppression. These ceremonies didn't just mark the beginning of a marriage, but the beginning of a woman's systematic dehumanization, establishing patterns of domination and submission that would define every aspect of her remaining life. Why medieval weddings were so brutal. Part 7. As if the horror of the wedding night wasn't enough, medieval marriage transformed into an ongoing system of legal and social imprisonment that would define every waking moment of a woman's existence for the rest of her life. The marriage ceremony wasn't just a single traumatic event. It was the gateway to decades of institutionalized oppression, where the very concept of a woman's individual identity was systematically erased and replaced with the legal status of property. Under the doctrine of coverture, which dominated medieval legal systems across Europe, a married woman ceased to exist as a separate legal entity the moment she spoke her wedding vows. This wasn't merely symbolic. It was a brutal legal reality that stripped away every vestige of autonomy she might have possessed. The Latin phrase, baron et femme sont une personne en ley, meant that husband and wife were one person in law, but that person was always, invariably, the husband. The woman simply vanished from legal existence, absorbed entirely into her husband's legal identity, like a drop of water disappearing into an ocean. This legal erasure was so complete that a married woman could not own property, could not enter into contracts, could not sue or be sued in her own name, and could not even make a will without her husband's explicit consent. Every penny she had brought to the marriage, every piece of land, every family heirloom, every tool or animal or scrap of jewelry, all of it became her husband's absolute property the moment the marriage was consummated. She had no more legal right to the possessions she had owned since childhood than a stranger walking by on the street. The psychological impact of this total legal annihilation cannot be overstated. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that you no longer existed in the eyes of the law, that every decision about your life, your body, your future, now belonged entirely to another person. You could not buy or sell anything, could not work for wages that you could keep, could not even give away a piece of bread without permission. You had become, in every legal sense, a non-person. But the horror went deeper still. Medieval law explicitly granted husbands the right to physically discipline their wives, using language that was chillingly similar to laws governing the treatment of livestock or unruly servants. The concept of reasonable chastisement meant that a husband could beat his wife with impunity, provided he didn't kill her or cause permanent disfigurement. Legal treatises of the period calmly discussed the appropriate size of stick a man could use to beat his wife. It should be no thicker than his thumb, giving rise to the phrase rule of thumb that we still use today, though most people have forgotten its brutal origins. This wasn't considered abuse, it was considered proper household management. Medieval marriage manuals, written by clerics and legal scholars, instructed husbands on the proper techniques for physically correcting their wives' behavior. Women who spoke back, who failed to complete household tasks to their husband's satisfaction, who showed any sign of independence or defiance, could be beaten without legal consequence. The law didn't just permit this violence, it actively encouraged it as a necessary tool for maintaining proper order within the household. The Church provided the ideological foundation for this systematic brutalization, teaching that women's subjugation was divinely ordained. Medieval sermons regularly reminded congregations that Eve's disobedience had cursed all women with natural inferiority, making them inherently prone to sin, weakness, and rebellion against rightful male authority. Women were described as the devil's gateway, creatures whose very nature required constant supervision and correction by their moral superiors, their husbands. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential theologians of the medieval period, wrote extensively about women's natural inferiority, arguing that they were defective and misbegotten creatures, incomplete versions of the male form. This wasn't considered misogynistic rhetoric. It was accepted scientific and theological fact, taught in universities and preached from pulpits across Europe. Women's subordination wasn't just legally mandated, it was portrayed as a fundamental law of nature and divine will. The economic dimensions of this oppression were equally devastating. Since married women could not own property or enter contracts, they had no means of achieving economic independence. A woman whose husband died might find herself completely destitute if he had chosen to leave his property to someone else, which the law permitted him to do. Widows often discovered that homes they had lived in for decades, businesses they had helped build, possessions they had brought to the marriage, none of it belonged to them. They could be turned out into the street with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Even women's reproductive capacity was considered their husband's property. Medieval law granted husbands absolute sexual access to their wives' bodies. The concept of marital rape simply didn't exist, because a wife's body belonged entirely to her husband. She had no right to refuse sexual demands, no matter how violent or degrading. Pregnancy and childbirth, already extraordinarily dangerous in an age without medical care, became additional tools of control. Women were expected to risk their lives repeatedly bearing children, with no say in the timing or number of pregnancies. The isolation that accompanied medieval marriage was perhaps the cruelest aspect of all. Once married, women were expected to remain within their husband's household, venturing out only with permission and usually under supervision. The female friendships and family relationships that might have provided emotional support were systematically severed. A woman's loyalty was expected to belong entirely to her husband and his family. Maintaining close relationships with her birth family or female friends was often viewed as a form of betrayal. This isolation served a deliberate purpose. It made resistance nearly impossible. A woman who had no independent resources, no legal standing, no physical freedom, and no emotional support network had virtually no means of escaping even the most brutal treatment. The few women who did attempt to flee abusive marriages faced a legal system that would forcibly return them to their husbands, often with additional punishment for the crime of abandonment. Medieval records are filled with court cases of women being dragged back to husbands who had nearly killed them, only to face worse treatment for their attempted escape. The law considered a wife's departure from her husband's household to be theft. She was stealing herself and the children she might have borne from their rightful owner. Even women who fled to seek sanctuary in churches or convents could be forcibly retrieved if their husbands demanded it. The psychological warfare of medieval marriage extended to every aspect of daily life. Husbands controlled what their wives ate, what they wore, whom they spoke to, how they spent every hour of every day. Women lived under constant surveillance, knowing that any perceived slight or failure could result in violent punishment. The stress of this existence, the hypervigilance, the constant fear, the complete lack of agency, would have been psychologically devastating even without the physical violence that so often accompanied it. Medieval marriage contracts sometimes included specific provisions about punishment, outlining in clinical detail exactly how wives could be disciplined for various infractions. These weren't considered unusual or extreme. They were standard legal protections for husbands, ensuring that their authority within marriage was clearly established and legally enforceable. Women entered marriage knowing exactly how powerless they would become, but they had no choice in the matter. The rare women who did manage to accumulate any kind of influence or respect within their marriages did so only by completely submitting to the system that oppressed them. They gained a measure of security by becoming enforcers of the very structures that had destroyed their own autonomy, teaching their daughters to accept subjugation and helping to arrange marriages for other young women. This created a vicious cycle where the victims of the system became complicit in perpetuating it, because submission was the only path to survival. Even death provided no escape from the reach of medieval marriage law. A woman's body after death belonged to her husband, who decided how and where she would be buried. Her children remained his property, and any wealth or influence she might have accumulated during the marriage passed entirely to him. she could not even choose her own final resting place or leave messages for her children without his permission. The systematic nature of this oppression reveals the true purpose of medieval marriage. It wasn't about love, companionship, or even economic partnership. It was about the complete subjugation of women as a class. Every aspect of the institution, from the wedding ceremony itself to the legal frameworks that governed married life, was designed to break women's spirits, eliminate their agency, and transform them into completely controlled resources for male use. This wasn't an accidental byproduct of medieval society. It was the deliberate, carefully constructed foundation upon which that society was built. The subjugation of women through marriage was essential to maintaining the broader systems of feudalism and patriarchal control that defined medieval life. By reducing half the population to legal non-entities, medieval society ensured that wealth, power, and authority remained concentrated in male hands, passed down through generations of men who had learned to view women as property rather than people. The brutality of medieval marriage wasn't an aberration or an extreme example. It was the norm, the expected standard, the carefully maintained system that kept medieval society functioning according to its own twisted logic. And the most terrifying aspect of all is how long these attitudes persisted. How many of these legal principles remained in force for centuries after the medieval period ended. And how deeply these patterns of thinking about women, marriage, and male authority became embedded in the cultures that grew out of medieval European society. The legacy of medieval marriage brutality echoes through history in ways that many people today don't fully recognize. A reminder that the fight for women's equality and autonomy is not some modern invention, but a response to centuries of systematic oppression that was once considered not just normal, but divinely ordained and legally mandated. The relationship between the lord and his peasants was not merely one of economic exploitation, but a systematic structure of ownership that extended to the most intimate aspects of human existence. Medieval serfs were not technically slaves who could be bought and sold individually, but they were bound to the land in ways that made their bondage nearly absolute. They could not leave the manor without permission, could not marry without their lord's consent, and their children inherited their bound status as surely as they inherited their parents' meager possessions. This feudal contract was presented as mutual protection. The lord provided security and justice in exchange for labor and loyalty. But in practice, it created a prison without walls. When serfs worked their lord's domain lands, they did so not for wages, but as an obligation, often during the very seasons when their own small plots needed the most attention. The timing was rarely coincidental. Lords deliberately scheduled the most demanding work during harvest season, ensuring that their crops took priority over the peasants' survival. The legal system reinforced this bondage at every turn. Manor courts, presided over by the lord or his appointed officials, handled disputes that inevitably favoured the landowning class. Fines for minor infractions, a chicken that wandered onto the lord's land, a day's work missed due to illness, a daughter who married without permission, could devastate a peasant family's already precarious finances. These weren't bugs in the system. They were features designed to keep the peasantry dependent and compliant. Perhaps most cruelly, the feudal system created artificial scarcity even in times of relative abundance. Lords maintained exclusive hunting rights over vast forests, making it a crime punishable by death for starving peasants to trap rabbits or deer. Fish ponds were similarly protected, even as children went hungry in nearby villages. The message was clear. Even the wild animals belonged to the nobility, while human beings had no inherent right to sustenance. The psychological toll of this system cannot be understated. Peasants lived with the constant knowledge that their labor enriched others while their own families remained malnourished, that their daughters might be claimed for the lord's pleasure, that their sons could be conscripted for wars that served only noble ambitions. This wasn't merely poverty. It was a deliberate architecture of humiliation designed to crush the human spirit and prevent any thoughts of resistance or self-determination. Yet even within this oppressive framework, the bonds of community among the peasantry provided crucial psychological sustenance. Families shared what little they had during the worst famines. Neighbors helped each other during harvest time, understanding that survival depended on mutual aid. Village festivals and religious celebrations offered brief respites from the grinding routine of labor and want. These moments of solidarity were perhaps the only thing that prevented the complete dehumanization that the feudal system seemed designed to achieve. The children born into this world knew no other reality. They learned from infancy that their role was to serve, to accept less, to expect nothing beyond what their betters deemed appropriate. Education was forbidden to them, not just because books were expensive, but because literacy might give them dangerous ideas about their station in life. The church reinforced this message, teaching that earthly suffering was divinely ordained and that questioning the social order was tantamount to questioning God himself. As we consider these long-dead peasants and their struggles, we see not just historical curiosities, but the foundations upon which our modern world was built. Their unpaid labor created the wealth that funded the Renaissance. Their suffering subsidized the art and architecture we still admire today. The castles that now enchant tourists were monuments to exploitation, each stone laid with the sweat of workers who would never live to see the inside of the halls their labor created. The medieval peasant's legacy lives on in ways both visible and hidden, in the stubborn independence that still characterizes rural communities, in the deep suspicion of authority that runs through folk traditions, in the understanding that dignity must be claimed rather than granted, that survival often depends more on community solidarity than on the promises of the powerful. Their resistance may have been quiet, their victories small, but their refusal to be completely broken echoes through the centuries as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Why medieval weddings were so brutal. Part 9. The systematic dehumanization of women in medieval society extended far beyond the marriage bed, permeating every aspect of their daily existence with a relentless brutality that modern minds can barely comprehend. The medieval legal system, designed entirely by men for the benefit of men, created a web of restrictions so complete that women became living ghosts, existing only at the mercy of their male overlords. Under the doctrine of coverture, a woman's legal identity was literally erased the moment she spoke her wedding vows. The Latin phrase covertura meant that she was covered by her husband's legal persona, becoming what the law coldly termed a femme couverte. This wasn't merely symbolic, it was a complete legal obliteration. She could not own property, sign contracts, or even write a will without her husband's explicit permission. If she had inherited lands or wealth before marriage, they automatically transferred to her husband, who could sell, gamble away, or destroy them without any consultation whatsoever. The woman who had once been an heiress could wake up destitute the day after her wedding with no legal recourse available. The psychological impact of this legal erasure was devastating. Imagine being told that you no longer existed as a person in the eyes of the law. Every decision about your life, where you lived, what you ate, whom you could speak to, whether you could leave the house, was now subject to another person's whims. Medieval legal texts described women as perpetual minors, never capable of reaching full legal maturity regardless of their age, intelligence, or capabilities. A woman of 40 with decades of life experience was considered less legally competent than her 15-year-old son. The brutality of this system was most apparent in the laws governing domestic violence. Medieval legal codes explicitly granted husbands the right to chastise their wives through physical force. The rule of thumb, a phrase that persists today, originated from English common law, which permitted men to beat their wives with sticks no thicker than their thumb. This wasn't considered abuse, it was considered proper household management. Legal texts compared wives to children, servants, and livestock, all of whom required physical correction to maintain order. Church doctrine provided theological justification for this systematic oppression. Medieval clergy preached that women were inherently sinful, weak-willed, and prone to temptation. They cited biblical passages about women's subordination while conveniently ignoring those about love and compassion. The story of Eve's disobedience was used to justify every restriction placed on women, as if all females carried the genetic burden of original sin and required constant male supervision to prevent them from corrupting society. Property laws were particularly vicious in their treatment of women. When a woman's husband died, she didn't inherit his estate. It passed to his male relatives or eldest son. She was entitled only to her dower, typically 1/3 of the estate's income, and even this could be contested or revoked. Widows, who might have worked alongside their husbands for decades to build family wealth, found themselves suddenly impoverished and dependent on the charity of male relatives, who often viewed them as burdens. Many were forced into convents or remarried against their will to men who wanted access to their meager dower rights. The legal system's treatment of rape reveals the depths of medieval misogyny. Rape was not considered a crime against the woman herself, but rather a property crime against her father or husband. The punishment was often a fine paid to the male guardian, as if the woman were damaged goods requiring compensation. If an unmarried woman was raped, she was frequently forced to marry her rapist, as she was now considered spoiled and unmarriageable to anyone else. This legal framework literally turned sexual violence into a pathway to acquiring a wife, incentivizing assault rather than preventing it. Women had no recourse through the courts because they could not testify in legal proceedings involving men. Their word was considered inherently unreliable, their testimony worthless. A woman could witness a crime, suffer abuse, or be defrauded, but she could not speak for herself in court. She required a male representative to speak on her behalf, and these men often had their own interests to protect. The legal system was designed to ensure that women's voices were never heard, their experiences never validated, their suffering never acknowledged. The guild system that governed medieval trades and crafts was equally exclusionary. Women were barred from most professions and could not join trade guilds that controlled economic opportunities in medieval towns. Even in trades traditionally associated with women, such as brewing or textile work, men gradually took control as these industries became profitable. Women were pushed into the lowest paying, most precarious forms of labor: domestic service, street vending, or prostitution. They had no economic independence and no pathway to financial security outside of marriage. Educational opportunities were virtually non-existent for women. While some noble daughters might learn basic literacy from tutors or in convents, the vast majority of women were deliberately kept ignorant. Knowledge was seen as dangerous in female hands, potentially leading to questioning of male authority or religious doctrine. Universities were exclusively male institutions, and women were barred from studying law, medicine, or theology, the very fields that shaped their oppression. The brutality of medieval marriage extended into the most intimate aspects of women's lives. Husbands had absolute sexual rights over their wives' bodies, and the concept of marital rape simply did not exist in legal or moral frameworks. Women were expected to submit to their husbands' sexual demands regardless of their own desires, health, or circumstances. Pregnancy was not considered grounds for sexual restraint, nor was illness or exhaustion. The marriage contract was interpreted as permanent sexual consent with no possibility of withdrawal. Childbirth, already dangerous in an era without medical knowledge, became even more perilous due to the legal framework surrounding it. Women had no right to refuse pregnancy or control the spacing of their children. They were expected to bear child after child until their bodies could no longer sustain the strain. If complications arose during birth, the priority was always saving the child over the mother. Women who died in childbirth were often blamed for their own deaths, accused of harboring secret sins that God was punishing. The few women who attempted to resist this system faced severe consequences. Those who fled abusive marriages could be forcibly returned to their husbands by law enforcement. Running away was considered theft. The woman was stealing herself, her labor, and her reproductive capacity from her rightful owner. Penalties included public flogging, imprisonment, or being locked away in convents. Some women were branded or mutilated to mark them as runaways, ensuring they could never escape their circumstances. The legal concept of petty treason made women's resistance even more dangerous. While killing one's social equal was murder, killing one's superior was treason, a far more serious crime. For women, killing an abusive husband was automatically classified as petty treason, punishable by burning alive rather than the more merciful hanging reserved for male murderers. This legal distinction sent a clear message. Women who fought back against their oppressors would face the most brutal possible punishment. Witch trials represented perhaps the most systematic and vicious persecution of women in medieval and early modern Europe. The Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, written by Heinrich Kramer in 1487, provided a pseudo-legal framework for identifying, prosecuting, and executing women accused of witchcraft. The text was filled with misogynistic assumptions about women's inherent weakness and susceptibility to evil. It provided detailed instructions for torture, designed to extract confessions from innocent women through unbearable pain. The witch hunt hysteria served multiple functions in maintaining male dominance. It eliminated women who were seen as threats: the outspoken, the independent, the knowledgeable about herbal medicine. It terrorized all women into compliance, showing them the consequences of stepping outside accepted gender roles. And it provided a convenient scapegoat for social problems, economic difficulties, and natural disasters. When crops failed or diseases struck, communities could blame women rather than examining systemic issues or male leadership failures. The torture methods used against accused witches were specifically designed to exploit women's bodies and psyches. The swimming test involved binding women and throwing them into water. If they floated, they were guilty of witchcraft and would be executed. If they sank and drowned, they were posthumously declared innocent. Pricking involved searching women's bodies for devil's marks using sharp instruments, often in intimate areas, combining sexual violation with physical torture. Sleep deprivation, starvation, and psychological manipulation were used to break women's minds and force false confessions. The legal proceedings surrounding witch trials were deliberately rigged against women. Hearsay was accepted as evidence. Torture-extracted confessions were considered reliable, and women's denials were interpreted as proof of their guilt. After all, the devil would teach his servants to lie convincingly. Women could not have male advocates represent them effectively because the crimes they were accused of were considered so heinous that helping them constituted complicity. The entire system was designed to ensure conviction and execution. Even women who survived witch trials faced permanent social destruction. They were marked as suspect, shunned by their communities, and vulnerable to future accusations. Their families were often ostracized as well, their children unable to find marriage partners or economic opportunities. The witch trial process created a climate of fear that extended far beyond its immediate victims, warning all women of the consequences of non-conformity. The property seizures that accompanied witch trials reveal another brutal dimension of this persecution. When women were executed for witchcraft, their property was typically confiscated by the authorities who conducted the trials. This created a perverse economic incentive to target women with assets, particularly widows who had inherited their husband's wealth. Some regions developed a systematic approach to witch hunting that was essentially a form of legalized robbery, targeting vulnerable women and seizing their resources under the guise of religious purification. The psychological trauma inflicted on medieval women extended far beyond individual cases of abuse or persecution. The entire social system was designed to convince women that they were inherently inferior, dangerous, and in need of constant male supervision. From childhood, girls were taught that their natural instincts were sinful, their desires were shameful, and their thoughts were untrustworthy. They were conditioned to doubt themselves, to seek male approval for every decision, and to accept suffering as their natural lot in life. Religious instruction reinforced these messages at every turn. Women were told that their pain in childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's disobedience, that their subordination to men was divinely ordained, and that their only path to salvation lay through perfect obedience and submission. The few female saints held up as role models were typically martyrs who had suffered extreme abuse, or women who had renounced all worldly desires and pleasures. The message was clear. Good women were either dead women or women who had effectively erased themselves. The economic dependency created by these legal and social structures trapped women in cycles of abuse and exploitation. Without the ability to own property, earn independent incomes, or access education, women had no alternatives to marriage and male protection. Even women who recognized their oppression had few options for escape. The rare woman who managed to accumulate resources through trade or inheritance found herself a target for forced marriage, legal challenges, or accusations of witchcraft. The medical understanding of women's bodies in medieval times added another layer of brutality to their oppression. Women were considered medically inferior to men, their bodies seen as flawed versions of the male form. Menstruation was viewed as evidence of women's inherent corruption, pregnancy as a form of illness, and childbirth as a necessary evil. Medical texts described women as naturally cold and moist, while men were hot and dry, leading to treatments that often worsened women's health rather than improving it. The lack of female medical practitioners meant that women's health issues were largely ignored or misunderstood. Male physicians, when they bothered to treat women at all, often prescribed treatments based on theological rather than medical principles. Women suffering from what we now recognize as depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress were diagnosed with hysteria and subjected to treatments ranging from useless to actively harmful. The male medical establishment had no interest in understanding or alleviating women's suffering. Their role was to keep women functioning as reproductive and domestic resources. The brutality of medieval marriage and women's oppression created lasting psychological and social damage that extended far beyond the medieval period. The legal principles established during this era continued to influence women's status for centuries, with coverture laws persisting in some form well into the modern era. The cultural attitudes toward women that were codified in medieval law and reinforced by religious doctrine created patterns of thinking that proved remarkably resistant to change. The normalization of violence against women that characterized medieval society had generational effects that are still visible today. When abuse is not only tolerated, but legally sanctioned and religiously justified, it becomes deeply embedded in cultural consciousness. The idea that women are property, that they exist for male benefit, and that their suffering is natural and necessary became so fundamental to Western civilization that challenging these concepts required centuries of struggle and continues to face resistance. The medieval period's treatment of women represents one of history's most comprehensive and systematic programs of human oppression. It was not the result of ignorance or primitive thinking, but rather a carefully constructed system designed to concentrate power in male hands while extracting maximum labor and reproductive capacity from women. The legal frameworks, religious justifications, and social institutions that supported this system were sophisticated and intentional, created by intelligent people who understood exactly what they were doing. Understanding the true scope and deliberate nature of medieval women's oppression is crucial for recognizing how deeply these patterns are embedded in our cultural DNA. The idea that women are naturally subordinate, that their pain doesn't matter, and that their voices shouldn't be heard didn't emerge from nowhere. It was carefully cultivated and legally enforced for centuries. The progress women have made in achieving equality represents a monumental achievement against overwhelming historical precedent. The legacy of medieval marriage and women's oppression continues to influence contemporary debates about gender, power, and justice. When we see resistance to women's equality in modern times, we're witnessing the persistence of attitudes and assumptions that were formally codified in medieval law. The fight for women's rights isn't just about current injustices, it's about dismantling systems of oppression that have been centuries in the making. As we continue to examine the brutal realities of medieval life, it becomes clear that the suffering inflicted on women was not an unfortunate byproduct of a harsh era, but rather a fundamental feature of how medieval society was organized. The systematic dehumanization of women served specific purposes, concentrating wealth and power among men, ensuring male control over reproduction and inheritance, and creating a permanent underclass of unpaid laborers. This was not accidental cruelty, but calculated exploitation, designed to benefit those in power at the expense of those without it. The courage required for women to resist this system, even in small ways, was extraordinary. Every woman who spoke up for herself, who tried to protect her children, who refused to accept abuse, or who dared to seek knowledge, was defying not just individual oppressors, but an entire civilization designed to crush her spirit. The fact that some women managed to survive with their humanity intact, that some found ways to help each other, and that resistance continued despite overwhelming odds, speaks to the remarkable resilience of the human spirit in the face of systematic brutality. The systematic brutalization of women through medieval marriage reached its peak in the arena of actual physical violence. While modern relationships are built on the foundation of mutual consent and legal protection, medieval marriage was essentially a license for systematic abuse, sanctioned by law, church, and society. The husband's right to physically discipline his wife was not merely tolerated, it was legally mandated and morally encouraged. The doctrine of reasonable chastisement gave husbands explicit legal authority to beat their wives, provided they used weapons no thicker than their thumb. Hence the origin of the phrase, rule of thumb. This wasn't considered domestic violence. It was considered proper household management. Legal treatises of the era provided detailed instructions on when and how to beat one's wife effectively. The husband was not just permitted, but expected to use physical force to maintain his authority and ensure his wife's obedience. Church teachings reinforced this violence through selective biblical interpretation. Passages about wives submitting to their husbands were emphasized while teachings about love and gentleness were conveniently ignored. Sermons regularly instructed men on their duty to correct wayward wives through physical punishment. The church presented wife-beating as a moral obligation. A husband who failed to discipline his wife was shirking his God-given responsibility as head of the household. Consider the legal precedent set in medieval courts. A man could beat his wife for burning dinner, speaking out of turn, leaving the house without permission, or even appearing insufficiently cheerful. These weren't extreme cases. They were standard legal rulings that define the parameters of acceptable marital violence. Court records from across medieval Europe show case after case where wives seeking protection from brutal husbands were told to return home and submit more completely to their husband's authority. The psychological impact of this systematic violence was devastating. Women lived in constant fear, never knowing what minor infraction might trigger a beating. This created a climate of terror that made resistance nearly impossible. Many women developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe trauma: hypervigilance, learned helplessness, and complete emotional shutdown. They were trained from childhood to expect violence and to blame themselves when it occurred. The isolation of medieval women made escape from violent marriages virtually impossible. Without economic independence, legal rights, or social support systems, abused wives had nowhere to turn. Their own families often refused to help, viewing domestic violence as a private matter between husband and wife. The few institutions that might have offered refuge, monasteries or convents, were expensive and required the husband's permission for entry. Medical knowledge of the time actually supported marital violence through the theory of the wandering womb. Physicians believed that women's reproductive organs could literally move around their bodies, causing hysteria and irrationality. The prescribed treatment was often physical shock or violence to force the womb back into its proper position. This gave medical legitimacy to wife beating, presenting it as therapeutic rather than abusive. The sexual violence inherent in medieval marriage was perhaps even more brutal than the physical beatings. The concept of marital rape simply did not exist. A husband had unlimited sexual access to his wife's body regardless of her consent, health, or circumstances. Women were expected to submit to sexual demands while pregnant, ill, or recovering from childbirth. Refusal was grounds for severe punishment and was considered both a legal and religious offense. This sexual coercion was compounded by the complete lack of understanding about women's reproductive health. Medieval medicine viewed menstruation as a form of purification and believed that women needed regular sexual activity to prevent their blood from becoming toxic. This provided another justification for forced sexual relations and created additional guilt and shame for women who tried to resist their husbands' demands. The breeding expectations placed on medieval wives created another layer of violence. Women were valued primarily for their ability to produce male heirs, creating enormous pressure to conceive quickly and frequently. Those who failed to become pregnant, or who repeatedly gave birth to daughters, faced not only physical punishment, but social ostracism and threats of divorce or abandonment. The legal system's response to domestic violence revealed the depth of institutional misogyny in medieval society. While a man could face legal consequences for damaging another man's property, including his wife, the same violence committed by a husband against his own wife was completely legal. Courts actually ruled that excessive kindness toward one's wife was a form of negligence that could result in legal penalties for the husband. Even when violence escalated to murder, the legal consequences were minimal. A man who killed his wife faced lighter penalties than someone who killed a stranger, and if he could demonstrate that she had been disobedient or unfaithful, he might face no punishment at all. The message was clear. Women's lives had little value beyond their function as property and breeding machines. The normalization of marital violence created a culture where extreme brutality was not only accepted, but celebrated. Stories circulated of husbands who had successfully tamed rebellious wives through savage beatings, held up as examples of proper masculine authority. These narratives reinforced the idea that violence was not only acceptable, but necessary for maintaining proper social order. The psychological manipulation that accompanied physical violence was equally devastating. Husbands were taught to alternate between violence and affection, creating trauma bonds that made it even more difficult for women to recognize their abuse or seek help. This cycle of violence and reconciliation kept women emotionally dependent on their abusers, while destroying their sense of self-worth and agency. The impact of this systematic violence extended far beyond individual marriages. It created a society where women's fundamental humanity was denied, where their pain was dismissed, and where their suffering was viewed as necessary for maintaining male dominance. This wasn't accidental. It was a carefully constructed system designed to break women's spirits and ensure their complete subjugation. The legacy of medieval marriage's institutionalized violence can still be felt today in attitudes toward domestic abuse, victim blaming, and the persistent belief that what happens within marriage is somehow private and beyond social intervention. Understanding this history is crucial for recognizing how deeply embedded these patterns of violence are in our cultural DNA, and how much work remains to be done to create truly equitable relationships. The brutality of medieval marriage wasn't an unfortunate side effect of primitive times. It was a sophisticated system of oppression that used violence, law, religion, and social pressure to maintain male supremacy. Every aspect of the institution was designed to break women's will and ensure their complete submission. This systematic dehumanization of women represents one of history's most comprehensive and successful campaigns of gender-based violence, the effects of which continue to reverberate through modern society. Part 11. The brutal reality of legal nullification. As we approach the final chapter of our exploration into why medieval weddings were so brutal, we must confront perhaps the most chilling aspect of all: the complete legal erasure of women's existence through marriage. While we have witnessed the physical brutalities, the psychological torments, and the systematic oppression embedded in medieval matrimonial practices, the ultimate horror lay in how the law itself became an instrument of absolute subjugation. The doctrine of coverture, which dominated legal systems across medieval Europe, represented more than mere inequality. It constituted the wholesale obliteration of female personhood. Under this legal framework, marriage didn't simply transfer a woman from one household to another. It literally erased her legal existence. The moment the wedding vows were spoken, a woman ceased to exist as an individual entity in the eyes of the law. She became what legal scholars termed femme couverte, a covered woman whose very identity was subsumed entirely under her husband's legal persona. This wasn't metaphorical or symbolic. This was literal legal death. A married woman could not own property, enter contracts, file lawsuits, or even write a will without her husband's explicit permission. She couldn't testify in court except in the most extraordinary circumstances, and even then, her testimony carried less weight than that of any man. If she earned money through labor, it belonged to her husband. If she inherited wealth from her family, it became his property. Even her clothing, her jewelry, her most personal possessions, everything belonged to him absolutely. Consider the devastating implications of this legal nullification. A woman who entered marriage with substantial wealth from her family would see it all transfer immediately to her husband's control. He could spend it, gamble it away, or gift it to his mistresses, and she would have no legal recourse whatsoever. Stories abound of medieval women who brought vast dowries to their marriages, only to watch helplessly as their husbands squandered everything, leaving them destitute and powerless. The psychological impact of this legal erasure cannot be overstated. Imagine being told, from childhood, that your very existence as a person would end the moment you married. That your thoughts, your desires, your needs would become legally irrelevant. That you would spend the rest of your life as a legal ghost, present in body but absent in the eyes of law and society. This knowledge shaped every aspect of a medieval woman's understanding of herself and her place in the world. The marriage ceremony itself became a ritualized enactment of this legal death. The moment the priest pronounced the couple wed, the woman's legal identity was extinguished, as surely as if she had died. In many ways, this was worse than death, because at least the dead were remembered as having once existed. A married woman was expected to forget that she had ever been a separate person at all. This legal nullification extended to every aspect of daily life. A woman couldn't seek medical care without her husband's permission. She couldn't travel beyond the immediate vicinity of her home. She couldn't make decisions about her children's upbringing, education, or marriages. She couldn't even choose what to eat, what to wear, or how to spend her time. Every decision, no matter how small or personal, required her husband's approval. The church played a crucial role in reinforcing this legal framework. Religious doctrine taught that a woman's submission to her husband was not merely a social expectation, but a divine commandment. Sermons regularly reminded women that questioning their husband's authority was tantamount to questioning God himself. The very wedding vows institutionalized this submission, requiring women to promise obedience in language that left no room for interpretation or qualification. Legal scholars of the time wrote extensively about coverture, treating it as a natural and beneficial arrangement that protected women from the complexities of legal and financial matters. They argued that women's minds were too delicate and limited to handle such responsibilities, conveniently ignoring the fact that unmarried women often managed complex business affairs quite successfully. The law was deliberately constructed to create and maintain female dependence, then pointed to that enforced dependence as evidence of women's natural incapacity. The consequences of this legal nullification rippled through every generation. Mothers had no legal rights over their own children and couldn't protect them from abusive fathers. They couldn't ensure their daughters received education or their sons were raised with respect for women. They couldn't accumulate wealth to provide for their children's futures or escape from dangerous situations. The law trapped them in cycles of powerlessness that were passed down from mother to daughter like a hereditary curse. Even in cases of extreme abuse, the legal system offered no refuge. A husband's right to discipline his wife was legally protected, and the threshold for what constituted excessive violence was grotesquely high. Women who fled abusive marriages could be legally compelled to return, and anyone who aided them could face severe penalties. The law treated a wife's body as her husband's property, and protecting property rights took precedence over protecting human beings. The economic implications of coverture were particularly devastating. Women were entirely dependent on their husband's financial goodwill, with no legal means of supporting themselves if that goodwill disappeared. A husband could refuse to provide adequate food, clothing, or shelter, and his wife would have no legal recourse. He could squander the family's resources on gambling, drinking, or extramarital affairs, leaving his wife and children in poverty while facing no legal consequences. This economic dependence was deliberately maintained through laws that prevented women from engaging in most forms of trade or commerce. While some exceptions existed for widows or women whose husbands were absent, these were grudging concessions that could be revoked at any time. The goal was to ensure that women remained economically vulnerable and therefore compliant with male authority. The psychological techniques used to enforce this legal subjugation were sophisticated and brutal. Women were taught from childhood that their value lay entirely in their ability to please men and bear children. They were told that independence was unnatural and sinful, that questioning male authority revealed moral corruption. Educational systems were designed to reinforce these messages, teaching girls domestic skills while denying them the literacy and numeracy that might enable economic independence. Religious institutions amplified these messages through constant repetition of biblical passages about female submission. The story of Eve's creation, from Adam's rib, was interpreted to mean that women were inherently derivative beings, designed to serve male needs. The tale of Eve's temptation was used to justify viewing all women as morally weak and prone to leading men astray. These religious teachings provided a seemingly divine justification for legal and social oppression. The few women who attempted to challenge these legal restrictions faced swift and severe punishment. Records exist of medieval women who tried to conduct business independently, only to be prosecuted for exceeding their legal authority. Others who attempted to leave abusive marriages were forcibly returned and subjected to additional punishment for their defiance. The legal system was designed to crush any hint of female autonomy before it could take root. Even women who accepted their legal nullification found themselves trapped in impossible situations. They were held responsible for their household's moral and spiritual welfare while being denied the authority to make meaningful decisions about how those households were run. They were expected to be wise counselors to their husbands while being legally prohibited from having opinions that mattered. They were supposed to raise virtuous children while having no legal rights over those children's upbringing. The impact of this legal framework extended far beyond individual marriages. It shaped entire societies' understanding of human worth and dignity. When half the population was legally defined as non-persons, it normalized the idea that some human beings were inherently less valuable than others. This dehumanization made it easier to justify other forms of oppression and violence, creating cultures where brutality was seen as natural and necessary. The legal nullification of women through marriage also had profound effects on men, though they were less immediately obvious. Men were raised to see women as possessions rather than partners, which stunted their capacity for genuine intimacy and emotional connection. They were taught that dominance was more important than love, that control mattered more than companionship. This created generations of men who were emotionally impoverished, even as they wielded absolute power. The children raised in these households absorbed these lessons about power, control, and human worth from their earliest moments. Boys learned that their future wives would be property to be managed rather than people to be cherished. Girls learned that their destiny was legal obliteration and that resistance was futile. These lessons were reinforced through every interaction, every story, every religious teaching, creating self-perpetuating cycles of oppression. As we near the end of our exploration, we must acknowledge that the legal brutalities we've examined were not aberrations or excesses of a less enlightened time. They were deliberate, systematic constructions designed to maintain male power and female subjugation. The legal nullification of women through marriage was perhaps the most comprehensive system of oppression ever devised, one that eliminated even the possibility of resistance by making it legally impossible. The marriage ceremony, with all its symbolic brutalities, was ultimately just the public face of this legal obliteration. The real horror lay not in the rituals themselves, but in the legal framework they represented. A system that could erase a human being's existence while calling it protection, that could destroy someone's autonomy while claiming to provide security, that could institutionalize brutality while wrapping it in the language of love and divine will. Understanding this legal dimension of medieval marriage helps us see how thoroughly the oppression of women was woven into the very fabric of society. It wasn't enough to control women's bodies or limit their movements. The law itself had to be restructured to deny their fundamental humanity. The wedding ceremony was brutal, not just because of what happened during it, but because of what it legally accomplished: the complete and total erasure of female personhood under the guise of sacred union. This legal nullification represents the ultimate brutality of medieval marriage. Not just the violence done to women's bodies, but the violence done to their very existence as human beings. In examining this final dimension of matrimonial oppression, we see how thoroughly and systematically medieval society worked to ensure that women's subjugation was not just physical or social, but legal, permanent, and absolute. Looking at your script summary and the reference materials, I can see you need to continue from where the medieval wedding brutality has been thoroughly established. Here's part 12 that brings everything to a powerful conclusion. As we reach the end of our journey through the dark corridors of medieval marriage, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The brutality we've witnessed wasn't an accident or an aberration. It was the entire point. Medieval weddings weren't brutal despite the system. They were brutal because the system demanded it. Every tradition we've examined, from the public bedding ceremonies to the legal doctrine of coverture, from child marriages to wife selling, served one fundamental purpose: to strip women of their humanity and reduce them to property. The wedding wasn't a celebration of love or partnership. It was a public auction where human beings were transferred from one owner to another. Consider the horrifying efficiency of it all. By the time a girl reached her 12th birthday, the system had already mapped out her entire existence. She would be married to a stranger chosen by her father. She would surrender her name, her property, her body, and her will to a man who could beat her, rape her, or sell her with complete legal protection. She would spend her brief life producing children in conditions so dangerous that death in childbirth was as common as surviving it. And if she dared resist any aspect of this fate, she would face punishment so severe it would destroy not just her body, but her very soul. The church, rather than offering sanctuary, provided the theological justification for this nightmare. Women were inherently sinful, they preached, cursed daughters of Eve, who needed constant male supervision to prevent them from dragging all of humanity into damnation. Marriage wasn't a partnership blessed by God. It was a necessary prison to contain the dangerous feminine influence that threatened the natural order. The legal system reinforced every aspect of this oppression with surgical precision. Under coverture, a woman ceased to exist as a legal person the moment she spoke her wedding vows. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or even control her own children. She became what legal scholars called a femme covert, a covered woman, literally hidden under her husband's legal identity like a burial shroud. The economic structures ensured that escape was impossible. Women were barred from most trades, forbidden from joining guilds, and denied access to education that might have provided alternative paths. Even wealthy women found their inheritance controlled by male relatives, their fortunes used as bargaining chips in political alliances they had no voice in creating. The social customs completed the web of control. The public bedding ceremony wasn't just humiliating entertainment, it was a legal requirement that transformed rape into a community celebration. The morning gifts and bride prices weren't romantic gestures. They were receipts for a transaction involving human flesh. The wedding feast wasn't a joyous celebration. It was a wake for the death of a woman's autonomy. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval marriage was how it weaponized love itself. The few women who found genuine affection with their husbands faced a cruel paradox. Their love became another chain, binding them to a system designed to destroy them. They learned to be grateful for kindness that was actually just the absence of legally sanctioned cruelty. They mistook brief respites from brutality for genuine partnership. The reproductive nightmare that defined most medieval marriages reveals the ultimate purpose of this system. Women weren't wives, they were breeding stock. Their value was measured entirely by their ability to produce male heirs, and their bodies were treated as public property in service of that goal. Pregnancy wasn't a joy to be celebrated. It was a death sentence to be endured. With maternal mortality rates approaching 1 in 3, every wedding was statistically likely to end in the bride's death within a few years. The psychological warfare was equally devastating. Medieval women were taught from birth that their suffering was not only natural, but morally necessary. They were told that pain in childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's sin, that submission to their husbands was their Christian duty, and that any desire for autonomy or equality was evidence of their corrupted nature. The system didn't just break their bodies, it convinced them that they deserved to be broken. The rare stories of resistance only highlight the system's ruthless efficiency in crushing dissent. Women who fled abusive marriages were hunted down like escaped slaves. those who refused arranged marriages faced imprisonment or exile. The few who dared to speak out against their treatment were labelled as witches, heretics, or madwomen, categories that conveniently justified any punishment their accusers could imagine. Even the supposed protections offered to women reveal the depth of their dehumanization. Laws against wife-beating weren't designed to protect women from violence. They regulated the acceptable level of brutality. A husband could beat his wife as long as the stick was no thicker than his thumb, as long as he didn't permanently disable her, as long as he preserved her capacity to bear children. These weren't protections, they were maintenance guidelines for valuable property. The intergenerational trauma this system created is almost impossible to comprehend. Mothers who had been brutalized were forced to prepare their daughters for the same fate. They taught them to accept pain, to suppress their desires, to view their own bodies as tools for male pleasure and reproduction. Love between mothers and daughters became a source of agony as women watched the system destroy the next generation, just as it had destroyed them. The economic logic underlying medieval marriage was coldly rational. In a world where land, labor, and lineage determined survival, women represented valuable resources that needed to be controlled and allocated efficiently. Marriage wasn't about individual happiness. It was about consolidating power, securing alliances, and ensuring the orderly transfer of wealth between generations. Women's suffering wasn't a byproduct of this system. It was the price the society was willing to pay for stability and order. The religious justifications provided the moral framework that made this brutality not just acceptable, but virtuous. Church teachings didn't just tolerate the oppression of women, they sanctified it. Marriage became a sacrament specifically designed to formalize female submission. The wedding ceremony itself was a religious ritual that transformed a girl into property in the sight of God, making resistance not just illegal, but sinful. The medical beliefs of the time provided pseudo-scientific support for this oppression. Medieval physicians taught that women were fundamentally inferior beings, governed by their irrational wombs and dangerous humors. Their supposed medical fragility justified excluding them from public life, while their alleged moral weakness explained why they needed constant male supervision. Science itself became a weapon in the war against female autonomy. As we look back on this dark chapter of human history, we must resist the temptation to view it as an aberration or to comfort ourselves with the myth of inevitable progress. The brutality of medieval marriage wasn't the result of ignorance or primitive thinking. It was the logical outcome of a society that prioritized male power over human dignity. It was a system designed by intelligent people who understood exactly what they were creating and why. The legacy of medieval marriage extends far beyond the Middle Ages. Many of the legal principles, social customs, and cultural assumptions that defined medieval weddings persisted for centuries afterward. Women didn't gain the right to vote until the 20th century. Marital rape wasn't criminalized in many jurisdictions until the 1970s. The doctrine of coverture wasn't fully abolished in some places until the 1980s. Even today, echoes of medieval marriage law can be found in legal systems around the world. In many countries, women still need male permission to travel, work, or access medical care. Honor killings, forced marriages, and female genital mutilation continue to destroy millions of lives. The fundamental assumptions that made medieval marriage so brutal, that women exist primarily to serve male needs, that female autonomy is dangerous, that male violence is natural and necessary, remain embedded in cultures and legal systems across the globe. Understanding the true brutality of medieval marriage isn't just an academic exercise. It's a moral imperative. We must confront the reality of what our ancestors endured and inflicted, not to condemn them from our position of supposed enlightenment, but to understand how seemingly civilized societies can systematically dehumanize half their population, we must recognize that the capacity for such organized cruelty isn't limited to any particular time period or culture. It's a human tendency that requires constant vigilance to resist. The women who suffered through medieval marriage deserve more than our pity. They deserve our recognition of their full humanity. They weren't passive victims of an unfortunate historical circumstance. They were human beings with dreams, desires, intelligence, and dignity who were forced to endure a system designed to destroy everything that made them human. Their suffering wasn't meaningless. It was the price paid for a social order that prioritized stability over justice, tradition over humanity, and male power over basic human rights. In remembering their stories, we honor not just their memory, but our responsibility to ensure that such systematic brutality never again masquerades as natural law, divine will, or social necessity. The brutality of medieval marriage wasn't inevitable. It was chosen, and that means we can choose differently. The wedding bells that rang out across medieval Europe didn't herald joy or celebration. They tolled for the death of female autonomy, the burial of human dignity, and the sacrifice of individual happiness on the altar of social order. In their echo, we hear the cries of millions of women whose lives were deemed less valuable than the stability of the system that consumed them. Their suffering was not in vain if we learn from it. Their voices, silenced for so long, can still teach us that no tradition, no matter how ancient or revered, justifies the systematic destruction of human dignity. No institution, no matter how sacred or fundamental to social order, has the right to reduce human beings to property. And no society, no matter how civilized it believes itself to be, is immune from the capacity to commit such organized cruelty in the name of order, tradition, and the greater good. Medieval weddings were brutal because medieval society chose brutality over humanity. In understanding that choice and its consequences, we arm ourselves with the knowledge necessary to choose differently and to recognize when the foundations of such brutality are being laid again in our own time.